Hello, everybody. Welcome to Find My Past from Home. It's always good to see you guys, and it's Friday, which means new records. So let us know where you're at, where you're watching from, as per usual. We've got Ellie in the comments today. Thank you so much, Ellie, for being with me this morning. Afternoon for many of you. Very quickly, just to let you know who I am, my name is Jen Baldwin. I am the North American Content Manager and the lead for the Global Ambassador Program at Findmypast. And I'm always, always, always happy to be on Findmypast Fridays. So chime in with your comments. Let us know where you're at and what's happening in your world. What stories are you working on? What's your research telling you these days? How is genealogy going for you? What is happening in your family history stories? We want to know. Right. So Karen, always good to see you. Nicole is in the West Midlands. Nicole, make sure you tune in next week because the session, actually, I will say this for anybody, the session we're planning on the West Midlands area is going to be phenomenal. I know I am definitely going to be watching. Sherry's here. Joan is in Mexico, sunny Mexico. Definitely jealous of that. Jane, hello. William, it's always good to see you. Let's see. Linda is in Nottinghamshire. Bonnie is in Iowa. Thanks for joining us, Bonnie. Jackie's out in East Sussex. Audrey, so good to see you, Audrey. Thanks for joining. William wants to know how the weather is here. I always forget to look it up, so I'm going to do that really quickly. It's supposed to snow tomorrow. I do know that. And it is roughly 42 degrees Fahrenheit at my house. I'm in Colorado. And hopefully it doesn't snow too much tomorrow because I have a big day planned, actually. So we'll see what happens with that. And I do not remember what the conversion is in Celsius, sorry, but it's very mild, I would say. Might rain later. Let's see. We've got Colleen from Essex, Lloyd in Nova Scotia in the Eastern Passage. Fantastic. I saw somebody from Australia. I see someone from France. Always very good to see everybody. Wendy's in Dallas. So many wonderful people chiming in. Thank you so much. Karen says Colorado's lovely. Went there a few years ago. It is lovely. We really like it here. Some beautiful scenery. Sandy's in Utah. Hello from North Carolina to Christine. Thank you for joining us, Christine. Ninny in Wales. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm really excited that all of you have joined us. And as per usual on Friday, we're going to obviously start with what's new on Find My Past. We release new records every single week, and we're always excited to let you know what those are. And then we have a fantastic topic for today and a really good question of the week. So I'm going to put the question of the week up. I'm going to ask you to think about this and start typing in your responses. Let us know what you think about this question of the week, and then we will go back to this week's records and give you guys some time. So the question of the week: were any of your ancestors affected by extreme weather or natural disasters? Now, I was inspired on this topic because 2 weeks ago, my area got a record amount of snow over the course of a 24-hour period. I will show you a picture in a few minutes. And of course, Australia has seen some pretty extreme weather in the last week or so. And back in the US, the southern United States, we had tornadoes and hurricanes even just yesterday. So how did your ancestors deal with extreme weather? Were they affected by it? Did they survive it? Did it change their lives? These are questions that we can answer and we should look into. But before we do that, let us, of course, go to this week's new records. So if you have research in Norfolk, you are going to absolutely want to make time to explore these records on Find My Past. This week, we released over 9,000 new baptisms for Norfolk from 1937. We did 16,000 new banns and marriages from 1921, and we also added to the burials collection. So it's a really good week for Norfolk researchers. We also added monumental inscriptions from Lincolnshire, over 36,500 new records, monumental inscriptions, and Essex monumental inscriptions as well, over 22,000 new records. So hopefully some of you have already started working on those new records. taking a look at what else you can learn. And we also did a huge amount of work in newspapers this week. So I want to make sure that you are aware of that. We added 6 new titles on newspapers, and we added additional materials to 17 titles. So a lot of newspaper research to do. It's really exciting. So we've got new titles. We've got a temperance movement paper that started in 1854, the Alliance News. We've got Set Makers and Stoneworkers Journal from starting in 1891. That one I think should be really interesting. I love occupational research, so we can dig into that. And then we've got some location-specific titles from County Durham, from Nantwich, from County Kent, and from South Wales. So some really good new material for everybody to play with. And then our updated titles, again, 17 newspaper titles were updated this week. So that is from Ireland, Wales, Northern Ireland, India, all over the UK, and specifically a big one, 37,000 pages added to the Herts and Essex Observer. So if you have research in those areas, you definitely want to be looking at the new material on Findmypast newspapers and or the new section on the British Newspaper Archive. Either way, you can access those materials. So that's this week's new records. Hopefully everybody gets a chance to play. Let us know what you find and let us know if you have success. We would love to hear your stories about new materials that we add to the site. It's always good to see what you guys discover. And you can tell us about that by using this very simple email address. If you make a discovery and you have a good story, we definitely want to hear about it. So discoveries@findmypast.com is where you can send those in. And we would love to hear about your stories and help you share your stories as well. So be sure to take advantage of that email address. All right, let me fling back to the comments really quick and see what you guys are talking about. Hello, Hillary. It's good to see you. Let's see. And Jackie asked, what are the new Durham records? That was specifically one of the newspaper titles. We added the Northern Guardian in Hartlepool, which is from County Durham, and that title starts in 1891. So let's see. Couple of people talking about the question of the week. Lynn has a good example. Question of the week. Her ancestors were affected by the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania, and of course the potato blight in Ireland. Yes, absolutely. Natural disaster that affected thousands and thousands of people across the world, actually. So that's a good one. Wonder what kind of research you've done on the flood in Pennsylvania and the impact it had on your individual ancestor. Lynn, we'd be interested in hearing about that. Beth has another good story for the question of the week. My great-great-uncle died and was buried in India pre-separation, now on the Pakistani-Afghanistan border. Where he is buried had a large earthquake after he died. His second wife and daughter had traveled back to the UK before the earthquake. Interesting. So I wonder if his grave was actually affected by that earthquake, or maybe the cemetery was okay. Very interesting story. We have Kathy, who says, my grandmother and her family nearly didn't make it across the Atlantic due to a terrible storm they sailed through in 1903. The captain of the ship was later the captain of the Titanic. Oh, wow. That's quite a story for sure, Kathy. Fascinating. So I would have to assume that you could access historical materials from the passenger line that he was currently working for, depending on who that was. That could be some really interesting research, Kathy. Let's see. Who else? Jane. My father's side would have experienced bad weather as 3 generations of master mariners all over the world under sail and steam. Yeah, definitely a lot of people have commented on this question with stories of their sailing ancestors or their sea ancestors. But I think it's all fascinating to me. I think it's a really interesting angle of research. Rosie, my 3 times great-grandfather, was watching the storm sitting outside his home in Canada of 1790 with his daughter, age 14, holding his baby son. He was hit by lightning, which killed both him and his daughter, but the baby survived. Oh, gosh. Yeah, when we talk about extreme weather, we definitely have to be ready for some of these really kind of horrific sounding stories, right? And these terrible events. So sometimes we do end up learning that our ancestors were involved in or died as a result of these types of situations. Lori says, my relatives left Nebraska for Victoria, Canada after a tornado destroyed their farm. That's interesting, Lori. So I have a similar story, though it's not my family. A number of years ago, I started to get into the history of meteorology. And one of the reasons for that was because I had a client who said she had an ancestor who had homesteaded in Kansas very successfully for a number of years. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, at the time when you pulled out a homestead in the United States, in the Western US, you actually had to prove improvements to the land. So you had to meet certain qualifications in order to actually keep the land. It wasn't just if you arrive here, you get it. You actually had to follow the rules and actually submit a report annually to actually show that you did what you were supposed to do. And then you got to actually keep it, and you were officially deeded the property after so many years. And so this particular individual, this family, was actually quite successful in their homestead. They went through the entire process. They were officially deeded the land, and they lived and had a very successful farm. Right? From all accounts, tax records and so forth showed that he was, this individual was quite successful financially and weren't really having any problems. And then he just suddenly kind of ups and leaves his farm, and he ends up in California. And the question that the client came to me with was, why in the world did he make this move? And we went through a number of resources, and we finally realized that his exact area had been hit by a tornado 3 years in a row. And so the theory that we created was that he moved to California because he simply got fed up with the weather. So we definitely want to make sure that we're looking at historical weather information so that we can show that these patterns exist, so we can explain why our ancestors may or may not have made the decisions that they did. It can be very, very interesting. Okay, so let's see. Hillary's got a story for us as well. My great-grandmother worked for the family of the first captain of the Titanic, Captain Haddock, who handed it over to Captain Smith in Southampton. Sounds like we've got some research connections happening possibly today, which is fabulous. Thank you very much, Hillary, for making that connection. That is really cool. All right, let's talk about the question of the week. I'm going to add this in. I'm going to make it look pretty. I hope. I was inspired this week to talk about severe weather because, quite honestly, this happened at my house. This is actually looking out my back door. So you can see like my patio furniture there and all of the snow that we got. We ended up getting over 24 inches in 24 hours, which is an incredible amount of snow, even for Colorado. And I started thinking about what that means and what that would look like in terms of, right, our ancestors, right? Obviously, this is a record-setting storm, but at the same time, this is not the first time a record-setting storm has ever happened. How did our ancestors, work around these situations? And especially if, they've just arrived in a certain area or they don't live in a really solid brick and mortar house. It's a pretty phenomenal thing when it's right in front of you, like this was for me, thinking about how they actually survived and how they got through this type of event. William says, where's the igloo? Yeah, my daughter actually did eventually make a snow cave. This was actually really very typical spring snow. So it was very wet, very heavy. It was perfect for snowballs, perfect for snow caves. We had a lot of fun in all of that. And we were safe and secure in our household. No problems here, but there were a lot of people across the state who lost power and that kind of thing. We were very grateful. We're very lucky to be in a nice warm home while this was going on. It's a little bit, it's a lot to deal with when you're trying to move your car around, for example, but it also added to the snowpack a great deal. So that was actually a real benefit. Let's see. Anne says it looks just like my daughter's front porch in Longmont, same buildings. Yeah, actually, Anne, I'm not too far from Longmont. So yeah, not surprising. Yeah, great skiing. Marion, absolutely. The ski industry definitely saw a boost, especially considering the COVID impact, right, of the ski industry here in Colorado. So let's look back in history, right? We got a couple of comments on this question of the week. in advance. I wanted to share a couple of those stories. The first one's from William. He said many ancestors of his served in the Navy, the Merchant Navy, dockyard service, and other sea-based careers. Over the years, would have had to put up with weird and extreme weather, especially his grandfather's generation, as they traveled from the UK to Bermuda and then to the Far East and back over a period from 1922 to 1960. So they would have put up with weather that felt really extreme to them compared to England. And I think that William's story makes a really good point in that it's not just about record-breaking storms, right? Like my picture of the snow. It's more about what would have felt and looked and appeared to be extreme compared to what our ancestors were used to on a regular basis. So when we're looking at historical weather data, we need to not just look at the big events, but we need to look at average climate, right? So we understand what would have been a big event, right? Maybe they just had an unseasonably warm week and that impacted them in some way. And that could explain decisions they made or movements they took, or traveling to the local parish or traveling to a parish a little bit further away for a baptism or some other event or an Easter service or something like that. So definitely take into consideration that it's not just the big events, but certainly what would have appeared to be extreme in their perspective. Right. Daphne says severe cold weather in Russia, you could wake up the dead. Yeah, I bet. We at one point, my husband and I lived in Montana, northern Montana, and we moved specifically because the weather was so extreme. We actually moved out of that state because I did not want to sit in negative 40 Fahrenheit temperatures with wind chill. That was just a little too much for me, even though the skiing was fantastic. Okay. So I've got a couple examples I want to share that I was able to find on Findmypast. And this the idea here is just to give you a start of where you might research some of these particular events. And certainly we're going to utilize newspapers a lot in this research, right? We're going to look at newspapers to document those extreme weather events for us. So I think when we think about these types of occasions, we definitely go to newspapers as kind of an automatic response. So this example from the Western Times from 1907 is actually talking about a storm in France, but it's reported, of course, in newspapers kind of all over the world. And they're talking about an avalanche that ended up freezing over the railway. And then the article went on to talk about the pleasantly warm weather in Germany at the time. So definitely we want to utilize newspapers. And I have a couple other examples, but it's not just always about newspapers, right? We want to understand in the timeline of our ancestors what events might have impacted our ancestors. So I just took a handful of events that came up on Wikipedia, to be honest, about big events that hit the UK. And globally. So the first one is 1816, the year without a summer. That, of course, would have been a global event. And we'll look at that in a minute. But we also have a number of localized events, right? There was a blizzard in the southern UK in 1881 in January of that year. There was, of course, the Thames flood in 1928. There was a storm referred to as the Royal Charter Storm in 1859, or the Great Gale of 1871 out in the North Sea. So definitely you want to understand kind of these big major events. But like I said earlier, you also want to understand kind of average seasonal temperatures so that you can understand how much of an impact it would make, right? How significant would it have been to drop suddenly 20 degrees or climb 20 degrees compared to the year before or the year after? So the year without a summer, I think, is an interesting one, very interesting one, actually, one that I'm kind of intrigued to learn more about. And I wonder how many of you have been able to actually document your family in the during that period, right? The year without a summer was in 1816. It was a result of a volcanic eruption. And this quote that I found from a Connecticut newspaper actually kind of really sums it up, right? But have we as researchers actually sat down and said, I've documented, I recognize that the summer of 1816 was different. Crops failed kind of around the world. There was a huge impact, economical impact from this particular volcanic eruption. And it certainly played into our ancestors' lives. Whether they, made a move or anything is almost irrelevant. It's the idea that they would have lived through that. So are there journals? Are there local newspapers? Are there manuscript collections? Are there, tax reports you could look up and identify if they lost crops or if they were okay, or like how they managed through that year. This quote from this Connecticut newspaper kind of tells the story for us. And I'll just read it. It is now the middle of July, and we have not yet had what could properly be called summer. Easterly winds have prevailed for nearly 3 months past. The sun during that time has generally been obscured and the sky overcast with clouds. The air has been damp and uncomfortable, and frequently so chilling as to render the fireside a desirable retreat. So for me, that quote from the paper really paints a picture of what they were enduring, right? It's the middle of July, and they're talking about getting cozy up next to the fire in order to, maintain warmth and get a reprieve, like probably a mental health, emotional reprieve from this experience. So it's a really, really fascinating area of research to work into. I sit and think about, where my ancestors were in 1816. I know that I had people farming in northern Pennsylvania and out in the wilds of western New York at the time. What were they experiencing? I had people down in Alabama. I had people in the UK, over in England, who were, one of my ancestors I can think of from the Birmingham area was only about 10 years old at this point. What did he see? What did he experience as a result of this particular event? So it's a really, really interesting area of research. And I could probably say that 100 more times. If we go back to kind of our newspaper research, this one I found kind of really interesting, actually. And it's actually a report in the Northampton Mercury from 1926. And it lists all of the known earthquakes in the area since 1623. So even if you can't find a source like Wikipedia or some kind of historical weather website, look to the newspapers to actually outline the events that occurred, as well as kind of some of these other sources, right? Because an article like this actually gives a lot of local information, right? Like the second entry for this 1750 earthquake talks about a violent shock, and even describes that a gentlewoman was thrown out of her chair and people ran out of the church. That's very localized storytelling that you're not going to find in some of these other kind of massive global or country level databases. So keep in mind that the newspapers might be really, really interesting in terms of not just describing the events, but also telling you kind of these little town details that you might not find anywhere else. And of course, you can look to materials like Percy, the Periodical Source Index, and a number of other society journals and that kind of thing to identify these events. Now, one area in which you might not think of right away, but is a great source, is monumental inscriptions. I just did a quick search of the Scottish collection just to find some examples. And I found this one for Alexander Atkinson, who was 73 when he died. But if you read the description, it says, that James Atkinson, his son, drowned. John Atkinson, another son, was killed by lightning in the boat of 10 brothers. And that's all in the monumental inscription on Alexander's stone, right? And in this case, there happens to be a photograph attached to the record as well, courtesy of the Scottish Monumental Inscriptions Project. So you want to make sure that you're utilizing even the standard kind of genealogy resources to identify these events and the impact they might have had on our ancestors. So I did a basic search. I opened Findmypast. I didn't put in any other search criteria except keywords like storm, avalanche, tornado, lightning, and I came up with thousands and thousands of hits across the site. Now, I didn't limit by country or year or anything else. So, you'll have varying degrees of results, but just to show that this type of information is actually included in what we think of as really standard stereotypical genealogical material. Okay, I'm gonna just scroll through comments here. There's a couple of question of the week responses, and I'm gonna put on the screen after we go through some of these slides. So bear with me on that. There's a comment about the thoughts that the reason for the migration period in Europe from around the 4th century was caused by volcanic eruption like this. Yeah. They have changed. Oops, I lost it. They have noted changes in pagan belief changed around the same time period as well. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, there's just so much information that we can glean from the weather, right? Most of our ancestors followed the weather, or they tracked the sun, like depending on what time period we're talking about. They needed to know what the weather was because they were agricultural or they had farms and stock. It was just as important to them as it was to us, and so as a result, obviously, we need to spend some of our research time on these materials. Now, one other example that I was able to find was actually in the school and university registers, and I honestly never probably would have thought of looking in these resources, but of course they would document extreme weather at schools as well, especially if it impacted the students or the operation of the school. You could say the same for prisons, right? This one is actually from the Giggleswick School. It was published in 1922. That school is located in Settle in Yorkshire. And it's an entry from their register of alumni and current students. And it talks about Charles Richard Fleming Hartley, who actually lost his life in March of 1903 while out sailing with a friend in the Firth of Forth near Granton. That is hard to say, Firth of Forth. The boat capsizing in a squall. And I found this by actually just typing in a keyword squall and scrolling through some of the results. So the possibilities of those keywords and how you approach this search is really kind of limitless. I tried to think of a bunch of different examples and just plop them into the search to see what would happen. And squall was a good one, right? Especially if you know about weather patterns kind of in the area you're researching, right? So if I was researching in Colorado, I would certainly search for words like blizzard or avalanche. But, choose what's appropriate to your location. Okay, a couple other stories to share. Colin sent this one in advance as well. He actually shared two with us, and I'll put both of them up. On the 2nd of June, 1838, at Besford, Charles Knight, a 9-year-old laborer, died from a visitation of God, and it was certified by the local coroner. And I was struck immediately by that term, right? A visitation of God. And while Charles was not mentioned, the newspaper reported that 2 other youngsters suffered awful deaths by lightning. So the assumption, of course, is that this visitation of God is actually a lightning strike that same afternoon in a storm that lasted approximately 30 minutes. So a fascinating story, Colin, tragic that this young man and 2 others suffered the same fate, but an interesting perspective for sure on how our ancestors thought of the weather, I guess is what I'm looking for. If I go back to that year without a summer, right? There was in New England, there were many religious movements as a result of the year without a summer. There was awakenings kind of all over New England because to them, it genuinely was a sign from God, right? And so we look at what was happening in history, the year without a summer, and we look at religious movements and the passions of our ancestors and comments like this, right? A visitation of God that leads us into yet another vein of research, right? Maybe they converted to a different faith and it was a direct result of weather, actually. And what a fascinating story to tell that would be. Linda and Trish both commenting that they're late to the party today. That's okay, you guys, because you can always watch this after the fact. It'll be on our Facebook page. It'll be on our YouTube channel. And we're always happy to have you, even if you come a few minutes late. No problem at all. All right, Colin's second story was also good. This one's definitely a bit longer. 1852 in Worcestershire, which is very hard to say. A woman in her 80s, third time's great-grandmother, drowned, and it was again certified by the deputy coroner after an inquest. The press coverage at the time revealed that a late disastrous storm hit the area that afternoon and lasted about 6 hours. It turned the river and its tributaries into the highest and most rapid waterways ever seen, and it followed days of extreme heat. I mean, we can all imagine what that situation looks like, right? You go through a handful of days where it's really unusually hot, and then all of a sudden the sky lets loose and you get this downpour for 6 hours. Um, the woman, his third time's great grandmother, was washed away from her cottage that evening, was not found until Tuesday morning. Her son, however, survived. The force of the water tore the roof off the cottage, and he was swept along until he eventually got caught in a tree. Some really, really thorough research that Colin has already done on these stories, but really fascinating and interesting aspects to our family history, right? These are the stories we go to with our other family members, and try to draw them in, right? This son, I mean, you can picture it today, right? I mean, I don't know about in the UK, but over here in the US, they certainly show when rescues from floods or hurricanes are happening. And I can immediately imagine a young boy caught in a tree, hanging onto a limb, and the helicopter coming over with the rope coming down, and, and somebody on the end of the rope. How would he have gotten out of that tree back in 1852? How would that have happened, right? Without the helicopter? Is he having to climb down into a boat? Like, I want to know the rest of this story for sure. I want to know, did he have to wait for the water to subside before he could climb down? How long was he stuck in that tree? These are the questions I would definitely be asking. Okay. All right. I think I just have a couple more things. I wanted to give you some examples. As I was looking into this, I found a couple of good websites that I thought were useful. So this one was Climate History in the British Isles. If you do a search on your favorite search engine, this should come up for you. It's actually a kind of a not the easiest website in the world to actually use, but I was able to find some really interesting information. And they had this huge timeline that they had built. I've just clipped a small segment of it starting in 1891, but you can see the kind of details you can get, right? So 18th of May, 1891, snow fell over a wide area in the Midlands and East Anglia to a depth of 15 centimeters. And then the next entry is the spring, early summer of 1893, where they're talking about how it's notably dry and persistently warm, right, coming into the spring. So there's a lot of information out there on just kind of generic websites that talk about climate history and specific events and dates. Now, in this case, you can see in the far column, there's some notations and page numbers. It does reference other material, and the citations will lead you down that path. This is the website itself. It's currently unfortunately, it's on the webarchive.org.uk. But this is what kind of their homepage looked like. So if you go to webarchive.org.uk and type in, meteorology at Westmore's historical weather events, you should be able to find it. But that's the URL that you want to start at, webarchive.org.uk. So unfortunately, it's not an active site anymore, but it's still available to us. And we can still use it to dig into some of that historical context. All right. And then another one that I located, which gives us a glimpse onto average monthly temperatures so that we can actually measure what was extreme and what wasn't. It's the Historic Station Data site. And if you just type into your favorite search engine, Historic Station Data, you'll find it pop up. And what they have done is they have locations kind of around the UK. In some cases, they have 50 years worth of data. In some cases, more than 100 years. So it just depends on what location you're looking for. But these have been historical station data, historical locations for reporting weather for a number of years. So I just picked Bradford at random, and you get this table, which you see to the right there, that talks about exactly what location is reporting, and then the average temperatures every month starting in 1908. So you see the months are numbered 1 through 12, and then it starts in 1909, and you just get the average temperature and rain measurement if they happen to capture that, the number of hours the sun was visible, those kinds of things. So keep in mind that it's an average, but that's, I think, probably sufficient for most of us, right? We need to know what was extreme and what wasn't, and knowing an average is actually is actually really important in that situation, right? And then, of course, there are also all sorts of resources to learn about how our ancestors learned about weather. So, this example comes from the Queensland Education Gazette down in Australia from 1911. This is available on Findmypast. And this is a weather chart that was actually drawn out in a report that was teaching the readers of this publication about how to actually identify weather systems and weather streams. And of course, this is in the baby years of meteorologic study, right? I mean, obviously humans have cared about weather for a long time, but how have they understood it over the years? I think that's important as well. How did our ancestors view weather? How did they explain it to themselves and to each other? So some interesting material if you want to go down that road as well. And I think, oh, yep, sorry, that's the end of that. So let me get that out of there. All right. So that's the examples I wanted to share with you guys today. Hopefully some of that has been a bit inspiring. Let's go to the comments. Now it's the time to do the fun stuff and share. And I'm going to go all the way back here. Let's do another comment from William. Thank you, William, for being a part of our community so frequently. While we're talking about extreme weather in 2018, a whopping 3 years ago, lots of Cumbria was cut off. The RAF were doing supply runs and farmers lost a lot of livestock too, followed by a heat wave with droughts, revealing old villages now located at the base of new reservoirs. Yeah, so that's actually a really good point. And I don't know if anybody else follows like archaeology news. I certainly do. But the changes in climate over the last couple of years, no matter how you see that, have revealed a number of opportunities for historians and archaeologists and have given us the chance to explore some areas like this, right? Some old villages, old communities, old human locations that we've not known about before. So the field is definitely still growing considerably. This one caught my attention for a different reason. Ruth says, my mom and dad lived in Buckley, North Wales, very cold winters. When my mom was a child, she saw a thunderbolt strike at the top of the hill on the road. I was also born in September 62, which followed onto the big freeze of 63. So eyewitness accounts to storm events. Now, the reason this caught my attention is because I grew up near a town named Buckley, and I didn't actually realize there was another Buckley in North Wales. So that's interesting little connection for me. And of course, then Ellie comes in, and she is very familiar with Buckley also, Ellie from Wales. So a nice little connection there between Ruth and Ellie, which is always fun. And Ruth continues this. I reckon we are related, Ellie, especially with the link through her dad's side. So hopefully another research connection happening. I'm going to count on Ellie and Ruth to follow up with us on how they shared their research in a upcoming Facebook Live session. And I'm just going to put her on the spot, make sure that she does this so that we can all find out how Ruth and Ellie are related. Time to share research, ladies. All right. I love that. I always love these connections. And it's one of the best parts of doing these Facebook sessions is seeing you guys actually connect with each other and sharing tidbits and information. And so, I mean, I can talk for hours and hours and hours, but what I really want to see is you guys actually making those connections. I think it's amazing. Patricia. My great uncle died at 7 years from a visitation of God. So Patricia, I'm wondering if it's the same. Is it a lightning strike? Have you identified what that actually was, that they labeled a visitation of God by our ancestors, but what was it in reality? Maybe it was a visitation from God. I don't know. It would be really interesting to hear back from you, Patricia, to see what you have learned about that. Okay, let's see. Claire says, I've been told I'm a distant relative of Grace Darling. I'm still trying to make the connection. She died out at sea trying to rescue others. Okay, that's interesting. Another interesting way to study these severe events and how they impacted our ancestors is, were they caught up in the rescue attempt, right? The rebuilding of buildings that were lost, maybe construction zones, that kind of thing. I mean, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, which obviously gets a lot of rain. And I clearly remember volunteering for sandbag duty when we were expecting big storms. Even when I was in high school, I would some of us would get pulled out of school in order to go to local communities and help sandbag and make big sandbag walls. And my parents were involved in a search and rescue team in the wilderness. And so that kind of activity has been a part of my life always, actually. In fact, my brother-in-law still volunteers for his local search and rescue in the mountains of Colorado. So it's always been kind of a part of our world, right? Is helping each other through these types of events. And the ramification of that help, right? Sometimes there is real severe risk involved. In this example that Claire gives us, the story of Grace Darling trying to rescue other people out at sea. So there's a lot of knock-on effect I think you can see from this type of research, right? It's it's understanding the averages, understanding what was typical, especially for those of our ancestors who were in the agricultural world, who relied on consistent rains, consistent sun, and so forth to help make sure that their crops were successful. It's the impact of moving into metropolitan areas over the course of history, as our ancestors migrated into metropolitan centers, London or New York or Boston or, other places around the world, Dublin. How did the weather impact this movement of the human race into these metropolitan areas? And what did they learn, right? Eventually, I've been through London and you see the markers from the flood. It's interesting to see the development of how we adapted to that kind of environment and how we adapted to the weather that became, severe events. Okay, let's see. Still scrolling through the comments, so give me just a second here. Oh, that's an interesting comment, Sally. Thank you for sharing that. In the 60s, my grandmother blamed the newly launched satellites for any odd weather. I've not heard that before, but I can actually picture one of my grandmas saying that. So that is definitely another interesting impact, right? How did this advance in technology impact our view as humans on weather events? And we could go down a million different roads with that topic, right? The impact of technology on our ancestors. Holy cow. That could be quite a lot. Victoria shares this response to question of the week. In August of 52, there's a huge flood in Lynmouth, Devon. Studied it in geography at school, ended up working there and was there for the 50-year anniversary. So that's now obviously part of Victoria's own story. And what an interesting story that would be. And I think about, it's another good point, right? Another great observation from our community that we need to be recording our ancestors' and experiences, but also our own, right? I think about the 2 days I spent watching the snowfall just 2 weeks ago. I haven't written any of that down. I need to. Last summer, there were severe forest fires in my area. And we have pictures of the sky just being black and the horizon just kind of being red and ash falling from the sky like a volcanic eruption. It was literally raining ash. You couldn't go outside because the air quality was so bad that nobody could breathe. But I've not taken the time to document any of those events in my own family history. So a lesson to me and to the rest of us who maybe have experienced or lived through some of these events and not thought to document them for ourselves, which is just, of course, always important. Okay, let's see. Here's another one from Trish. When my grandfather died in January of 45, the weather was bad and there was so much ice on the roads. They took him through the streets on a cart to the cemetery. Oh my gosh. Another great story. So I would ask, in this situation, is that an oral history that's been passed down to you, Trish? Or is that something that you can document through newspapers? The parish records perhaps might have recorded something. Maybe the priest happened to write something down about that because it was such an unusual circumstance. Another example pops into my brain. In Breckenridge, Colorado in the 1870s, 1880s, they wanted to move a building. It was up on a hill and they wanted to move it down to Main Street. And so they waited for winter specifically to do this. And they essentially joisted the building up, put it on what essentially were ice skates, and slid it down the building using ropes to control its speed. And that's how they moved the building. So maybe our ancestors relied on the weather to use as a piece of technology, as a tool, right? Instead of just being affected by this kind of extreme event. So yeah, fascinating, right? Fascinating. We could just go all day with this kind of stuff. Let's see. I'm gonna scroll for just another minute. Oh, here's a follow-up on Grace Darling. Thank you, because I actually am totally unfamiliar with this story. Angela says Grace Darling died of TB and is buried at St. Aidan's Churchyard in Bamberg. Not sure if Ellie says I got that right. Thank you, Ellie. She was a lightkeeper's daughter who was involved in a rescue at sea when quite young. Oh, maybe I do know this story, actually. It's starting to perhaps hit my memory. I feel like my daughter had a little kid's book about something like this. I wonder if that's possible. Okay. Let's see. And I think about things in different economies, right? I've mentioned the agricultural world a number of times today, but what about people like miners, right? They would have certainly been affected by severe flooding, severe rains. What did it look like in an average day if there was an extreme amount of precipitation to that economy? So there's all sorts of opportunities here. Linda gives us a modern example. Living in New Zealand when an earthquake epicentered 2 miles in the road. Weird feeling hearing the ground roar and house shake. Yeah, Linda, it's definitely bizarre. I only remember one earthquake when I was growing up, but they were frequent in my area. And it was very strange. But I also think about, there's some really famous footage from the 1960s of a bridge near where I grew up. And it's just, doing this wave effect as the earthquake ripples across and moves the earth. So yeah, really, really interesting to kind of get that local knowledge and history. Earthquakes are such an interesting thing to live through, but there's so many different variations of extreme weather that we could consider extreme events like this that Mother Nature throws at us. So it really is kind of the sky's the limit here. Let's see. Oh, we've got a couple birthday celebrations coming up. It looks like that's a lot of fun. Happy birthday to you both. Let's see, Diane and Jane. Diane has a great little story, though. My birthday is on Sunday, so happy birthday again, Diane. And all I got told was that it was snowing when I came out of the hospital. So now's your chance, Diane. You get to go back and look at newspapers and other materials that you can find to figure out exactly what was happening that day. I definitely know that it was very hot. I was born in July, and it was an unusually hot day the day I was born. And my mom was complaining because of the heat, but not because of labor and delivery. Go figure. But hey, I was number 4. Maybe she was used to it by then. Audrey shares with us, my sister-in-law was on a plane coming in to land at Gatwick during the Great Storm of 1987. She's not a nervous flyer, but she knew it was serious when she could see garage doors flying through the air. Oh yeah, I think I would take that pretty seriously as well. Yep. That's I wonder, Audrey, if you've taken the time to record her memories of that. Now I'm going to put you on the spot and make sure that you have that oral history recorded for future generations. Oh, Joan reminded me. Joan, thank you very much. It was Galloping Gertie, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. That is exactly what I was referring to earlier with the bridge that was doing this. Appreciate that, Joan, because it did escape my memory in the moment. Beth has a great example for us for coal, those in the coal industry. Aberfan was a coal mine accident in 1966 where a school was destroyed, killing 5 teachers and 109 children. Wow, that's crazy. We focused today mostly on weather events, but we haven't really talked about human-created disasters, right? And that's certainly a whole different topic we could go delve into. But I would suggest similar resources, right? Newspapers for sure, local and county publications, Genealogical and Historical Society publications, and then, very typical standard genealogical records. I didn't get a chance to dive into the holdings of the British Library or the National Archives. I'm sure they have materials as well. Let's see. Oh, yeah, Mary, this is a great example. Thank you, Mary, for sharing this. One of my cousins in Australia has been documenting on Facebook the floods that are happening as we speak. Some pretty extreme damage happening down there. Videos of her neighbors' houses floating by and stories of rescues. They've been through so much last few years with fires and floods. The latest is the migrations of swarms of spiders trying to evade the floods. That would be the absolute worst. Agreed. Spiders, no thank you. But I would definitely not want to deal with what Australia is going through right now either. And I think it also brings up it hits me with another point, right? We do tend to document these things on platforms like Facebook, right? When that snowstorm hit my house 2 weeks ago, I definitely shared pictures on Facebook with my friends and family. And it's gotten to the point where our local news reporter kind of jokes about how many pictures they're going to get in of people's patio furniture, um, which always makes me laugh. And the snow accumulation on the furniture. But how else are we doing this, right? Because we have to assume that at some point Facebook will no longer be here, right? In 100 years, will people still be able to access our Facebook archive? Is it the only place we're documenting these events, or should we be pulling that information into a different format? I'm of the opinion that we need to, and I would encourage you to do it as well. I know in the US, and I think it's a global site actually, there is a genealogy website, and the name of it escapes me right now. Maybe one of you, I think it's disasters, something with disasters in the title. And the host of the site, whoever that is, actually is listing out all of the historically relevant disasters that occur. And I know there's a lot of mining accidents, for example, in that database. It's a relatively simple site to find if you just use your favorite search engine and look for genealogy and disasters. I'm sure it will pop up. To that effect, there's been a handful of comments now, loads of mining disasters, rock falls, as well as flooding. There are some harrowing accounts in the 1842 Children's Commission. Some of them are on the Scottish mining website. Oh, so there's a Scottish one in particular, which is good as well. And I'm sure there are for other, major areas for the mining industry. So that's a good one to have in your back pocket. And then let's finish. We've only got a few minutes left. So thank you all very much for sharing your stories. I'll throw one more up from Roxanne. Far more recently, but about a year ago, my mom's area was hit with a tornado. It picked up an entire house a short way away from her and dropped it in the middle of the road. I ought to attach the news article to her on our tree. Yes, you absolutely should. Use that ability to touch the media on your tree. Because just like with other digital products, right, like Facebook or our own personal websites that we own, right, the more places we put this information, the more likely it is to outlast technology. Carolyn says to that extent, on that point, the only media that will not change is pen and paper. And I agree, Carolyn, but I also think it's very important to keep up with technology, right? So right now, my material is backed up in a number of different ways. And every time they come out with something new, you have to reinvest and re-back up. But it's up to us to make sure that these stories are preserved, not just on Facebook, but modern events, things that are happening right in front of our faces. We need to make sure that we're documenting carefully and make sure that documentation follows us through the generations. All right. I think that's about all the comments. I think I got most of you. It looks like lots of comments just talking about the weather in general, which is always good to see. I have learned working for Findmypast that every meeting in England and Scotland, perhaps in Ireland, starts with a local weather report from everybody participating in the call. So I typically, it's one of the first things I do in the morning is I get up and I check the weather at my house, not because I'm going to be affected by it, but because someone in my atmosphere is going to ask me what the weather is today. And I usually do the conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius. But it's really interesting. It's an interesting bit of culture, right? That we talk about the weather today so much. I have to imagine that our ancestors 100 years ago, 200 years ago, did the exact same thing, right? As they connected. And so as you're looking through letters that you might have in your collection or accessing manuscript collections, look for those indications. Don't dismiss the daily weather report that you find from your ancestors' writings and from their journals or what other topics they have. Um, I know I have a friend and colleague who has his grandmother kept a series of daily journals. So every single day she would write something in her journal. It might have been one sentence, it might have been, a whole story. And she has decades of them. And can you imagine? There's just a whole row of these journals on the bookshelf. And the amount of history and data that's in those types of documents, those types of materials is really, really valuable. It's not just about when someone was born or, how she felt the day that her son got married. It's about that daily average experience, right? The daily life of the common person anywhere on the globe. What was that like? What did our ancestors actually go through every day of their life? And we may not be able to document every single day, but we can certainly document the big events and what it was like leading up to and the aftermath of those events. Oh, Matt, I have to share this one. This is a great comment. Thank you, Matt, for this. In the UK, it's a national obsession to talk about the weather, especially residually with strangers. It's always either too hot, too cold, too wet, or something else wrong with it. I love it. Matt, that is the perfect way to finish this session today. Thank you very much for that. And I said that, but now, of course, I have to share this from Audrey because it's a great tool that we should all know about. Thank you, Audrey, for sharing this. An enhanced cataloging project at the National Archives of the Records of Railway Accidents. Details in section 5.3 of the Railways Guide. That is very specific, Audrey. Thank you. No name indexing, but date and place. And she's given us all a URL to take a look at. I will definitely have to investigate. That sounds like a really intriguing resource. So thank you, Audrey. Thank you always for sharing your wealth of knowledge from the National Archives. We always really appreciate everything you contribute. Ellie's saying, guess I'll have to buy a new notebook. I think you are right, Ellie. I'm going to have to as well. I need to start documenting these things on paper so that it outlives me for sure, no matter what happens with our technology. So thank you all very much for being with us today. It's always, always, always a pleasure. Next week, we have a couple of really good sessions. The one I mentioned earlier on the West Midlands, the Black Country, really excited for that. And then, of course, we'll be sharing on Find My Past Fridays. As always, you can always find us on Fridays, 4 p.m. UK time. Always, 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 no matter what else is going on in the week, you know how to get a hold of us. And again, of course, we would love to hear about your stories and your discoveries, whether you've made them on Find My Past or through other materials, maybe your own personal collection of materials at home. What inspires you? What has driven you to keep going in your family history? What are the stories that stay with you and the ones that you make sure that you tell your grandchildren about? We would love to hear those stories as well. And we would love to highlight those stories. So please, please send us your information, discoveries@findmypast.com. This effort, this community, it's all about you. We want you to be the featured, content on this channel. And we want to make sure that we are sharing your successes with everybody around the world. And we're excited about the research that you do. So please make sure that you're sharing with us. We really love to hear it. Okay. We have now run out of time. We're really excited to always be with you on Fridays. I'm sorry, there's a couple other comments coming in that I'm trying to read quickly. So we will see you again next week. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Enjoy the weekend, we hope. Stay healthy. Take care of each other out there. Take care of yourselves. And we will see you next time on Find My Past from Home. I almost forgot the name of it. Find My Past from Home. Thank you all very much for being with us. Have a great day.